It's 10:34. It's the 13th day of March 2021. It's Daylight Savings Time weekend, and I'm pretty sure St. Patrick's Day is in there somewhere. Just green beer or whatever. And it is me, your grumpy guide to all things gaming, the OGGM. And it's Mega Dungeon March Day 3. Blah, blah, blah. Mega Dungeon, really big place underground that makes no sense. Blah. Okay, so in trying to understand and wrap your mind around the idea of Mega Dungeon versus regular dungeon, in our previous installments, we described what a Mega Dungeon is, opposed to a regular dungeon. And we asked the questions of the first three questions: who, what, and where. Who built it? Why did they, who, what, and why, or who, where, and why. Who built it? Why did they build it? And where did they build it? Because I don't even know what I'm saying. Who built it? Why did they originally build it? And where did they originally build it? Because, let's face it, nobody sets out to build Undermountain, Barrowmaze, Stonehill, Castle Greyhawk. They set out to build, a castle, a tomb, a cave. And then things happen, and time passes, and more things happen. And maybe that guy dies, but somebody else moves in and, just keeps expanding it. And it's like Winchester Mystery House, and then it just keeps getting bigger and just more ridiculous. And then, 100 years later, you're like, well, how did this happen? I don't remember building this. This place is huge. It makes no sense. And to use our real world model of a actual closest thing we could have to the real world of a mega dungeon, the Pentagon, IKEA, or in the case, UCLA, University of California, Los Angeles, which is freaking huge. It's a lot bigger than you think, because even if you look at the map of UCLA, that doesn't count adjunct buildings and extensions and the original buildings that are still technically attached to it, and the UCLA underground for maintenance and stuff like that is freaking huge. So that would be one of our real world examples. Another real world example would be the Pentagon. The Pentagon is freaking huge, and even from the surface it's huge, and then that's not counting what's underground and adjunct buildings and extensions and things the Pentagon is connected to. It's I don't even think people who work in the Pentagon actually know how big it is. So that moves us on to our next question. Who built it? Whatever. Politicians and the military for the Pentagon, and for UCLA, educators. Why did they build it? Well, as we discovered last week, UCLA's original purpose and what it is now are completely different. And the Pentagon was built to house people who were doing things that they didn't want, we don't want you guys over here. We're going to let you have your thing over here to do whatever it is you do. I think it involves tanks and airplanes. We don't know. So whatever. Who built it? A bunch of religious people. Why did they build it? To celebrate their dead. Dias de la Muerte. Where did they build it? In the sort of semi-swampy flatlands, in the middle of some grassy plains, in the middle of downtown LA. Now, the big question when addressing this bizarre monstrosity that is a mega dungeon, how did it get so freaking huge? How did this go from just a few simple buildings to, this outrageously huge, ridiculous place, with things like this in it? Nobody sets out to build that. That's just that just happens for over years of just weirdness and cults and magic and dinosaurs and Nazis and clowns and alien spaceships. So how did Undermountain get so big? How did UCLA get so big? How did the Pentagon get so big? How much time has passed from the original day to, look at the size of this thing, to today? That is your main question, because when you start, discussing how, that helps with the building. How did he, and if we're following Undermountain or UCLA, okay, so UCLA started in one place. It started as part of the library in downtown Los Angeles. Now, downtown Los Angeles is a hop, skip, and a jump from where UCLA is now. So it started here. But then this wasn't big enough for everything they wanted to do. So they got their hands on some property and they decided to move it from here to here. And in order to move it from here to here, an infrastructure had to be developed because there was a lot of stuff here and they needed to move this stuff here over to here. So they had to build roads, they had to redirect traffic, they had to build some underground tunnels. Some of the stuff had to go into a storehouse for a while this was still being built and they were emptying it as this. So here's UCLA 1, here's UCLA 1A, the storehouse, and then here's UCLA 2, the new UCLA in Santa Monica, the original buildings that will eventually grow to become UCLA, our dungeon, mega dungeon as we know it today. So already we see that the thing has grown from here to here to here, and there's things connecting it. And then of course we can just think into the ridiculous, dungeoneering where there's like caverns and caves and tunnels. And let's say while, in infrastructure, they had to build roads that went around things and they had to build a new storehouse. And let's say while they're going from our original property to our new property and, making these tunnels and making these warehouses and building these new things, what if they find something? Because if you read the history of Undermountain, a lot of that was Elminster went down there for one reason, and while he was doing that one reason, he found other stuff, He found old caves, he found deposits, he found fossils, he found weird things that slowly, drove him insane, but also made him want to investigate further. And we can follow that even further. If we go from downtown LA to Santa Monica, we're passing pretty close to the La Brea tar pits. We're passing through land that was once, heavily populated by indigenous species. So, buildings have already been built up. So while we're digging through, we could find like some old buildings, some tombs of indigenous species, some tar pit shit, maybe since you're talking D&D, maybe some of those dinosaurs aren't as dead as you thought it was. Plus, we're right near the San Andreas Fault, so that means there's probably some underground caves, some lava tubes. Who knows? There's some weird crab monsters living down there. We got millions of years of sedation and seawater lowering and air pockets and fossils. All this is being discovered while we're moving from here to here. And each one of those discoveries adds to the growth of the mega dungeon. If we're talking Barrowmaze, it's like these guys did their original church, city, necropolis, Deus de la Morte, let's celebrate the dead, and then they moved on. And some other people came in and built upon that. The great thing about Barrowmaze, the good bad thing about Barrowmaze is it has one consistent theme: undead, death, and all sorts of things undead, death related. Which means there's certain things you're not going to find in here because it does really sort of tell a consistent mega dungeon story about this huge Barrowmaze, this huge underground city of the dead and everything that's on top of it. If we're using UCLA as our mega dungeon example, then again, there's certain stories we're never going to tell with this sort of giant mega dungeon university or whatever the D&D version of UCLA would be. But there are several stories we could tell, and we're telling a consistent story of how it went from here to here to here, everything that happened between here and here. And then things start happening over here. Now we're in our new location and time passed. Because remember, UCLA was built before World War I. So World War I happens. UCLA has to grow and change. World War II happens. UCLA has to grow and change. The world changes. Technology changes. Santa Monica changes. And with those changes, UCLA grows, it changes, it adds new things to it. Other things are forgotten about and then rediscovered later on. As they're building, of course, they have to build substructures and infrastructures. And every time you do that, you're risking, what's underground? What's down there? I don't know. We find some fossils. We find an underground sea. We find some old lava tubes. We find indigenous species burial ground. We find some radioactive isotopes. Grow, change, but still it's still got that basic UCLA theme. Wow, UCLA, you are getting a lot of free advertisement from me. You should probably sponsor me. But it's great because it's one of the few things I know that we have in California other than the Winchester Mystery House that sort of is the closest thing to real life mega dungeon. If we want to look at like real life puzzle funhouse dungeons, the Winchester Mystery House is probably the closest thing we have, in California. Hearst Castle would be another one. I guess technically Disneyland, because there's a whole bunch of stuff under Disneyland, would be another one, So there are real life examples that we could use to reference as mega dungeons or regular dungeons. And for the case of this argument, we're using UCLA, Winchester Mystery House, places like that, places that we know and we can look at and see. If you look at UCLA from the air and the entire thing, it's huge, but it's actually huger than even that because there are things, UCLA adjacent, UCLA distance, plus the original buildings where UCLA is, which makes this idea of this mega dungeon kind of start to make sense, to kind of percolate in our brain of how this happened, how things moved from here to here to here, what happened during the time that it took, how the world changed while it was here, while it was slowly growing, why its very mission of what it was originally built for changed. It's influenced by everything that comes in. Plus, every time it grows, something has to make way. And every time you do that, there are things that you have to deal with. There are, ruins, buildings, property, all that stuff. So the how is the single most important. How long has it been there? How did it get built? And what happened while they were building it? Once you have that timeline, once you have that imaginary history in your mind of how this place got to where it is today, then you can start moving inwards and filling in the holes. We have a history, we have a timeline, we have a general idea of what happened when and how this thing became part of this thing. And we can start, theory crafting. Well, what did they find while they were doing this? What would be down there? What would be over there? What happens when they knock this building over to make way for a new building? What happens, when 50, 100 years pass and all these guys are all dead and a whole bunch of new guys come in and they don't have any idea what the original guys were doing. And they're just like, how long it has been there and how did it happen? Start thinking about those ideas along with the previous ideas: who, where, why, how. And then we get to our next big question: what? If you appreciate this content and want to see more, comment down below. If you don't appreciate this content and think I should shut the fuck up, comment down below. If you haven't had a chance to subscribe yet, please subscribe. Help me hit 500 subs by August 4th. And remember, if we hit 350 subs, the 350th sub will win a copy of that Mutants and Masterminds on the shelf behind me. Barrowmaze, thank you. UCLA, thank you for, all the free press I'm giving you, I guess. And Dr. Pepper, support me. I will talk to you later. Happy Daylight Savings Time.